Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this technical talk. Today, we have Professor Brokoslav Laschowski from University of Toronto, who is going to give a talk titled Computational Neuroscience from Brain-Inspired Algorithms to Brain-Machine Interfaces. I am not going to read his biography. It is in the meeting announcement. Without further ado, Brokoslav, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ivan. Let me just share my screen. You can see my screen?
Yes.
One second, I'll just minimize this. One sec. Get this out of here somehow. Okay, perfect. Let's move that over there. Okay, awesome. Well, first and foremost, thanks for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. I wish I could be there in person, but my wife just had our second daughter, Anna, and so I'll be avoiding travel for the next few months.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as was mentioned, I'm Brokoslav Laschowski. I'm a research scientist and principal investigator at the University Health Network, which is one of the largest research hospitals here in Canada. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Toronto with appointments in neuroscience and mechanical engineering. And so today I'll be presenting a relatively high-level overview of my research lab and our development of computational models for brain science. Okay. Now, in addition to being a lab director, I'm also the director of the summer research program at the University of Toronto for student refugees from Ukraine, with the majority of our students being women. And this program was funded by the Department of Computer Science and the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence in partnership with the Robotics Institute. And none of this would have been possible without my co-founder, Dr. Michael Brudno, who's the associate chair of our computer science department. And so if you're interested to learn more, there have been a number of news articles that have been published about this outreach work. Now, with regards to research, my lab specializes in computational neuroscience, which is just a fancy way of saying that we study the brain using computational tools and principles. Now, you may not have thought of this, but the human brain can be viewed as an information processing system. So, like a computer, but a biological computer, whereby we integrate sensory information with prior knowledge using Bayesian inference in order to make decisions and take actions in our environment. So, in this manner, we view the brain as a machine rather than some mystical thing that's beyond our understanding. Okay? And this kind of computational framework can be dated back to the 1950s, where Alan Turing famously introduced the Turing test and this concept of human intelligence as computation. Now, there are a number of applications and motivations to study the human brain using this kind of computational framework. For example, we can build computational models of the brain to advance our understanding of human intelligence, such that we can reverse engineer and discover the fundamental principles that govern the brain. Not to mention the fact that understanding human intelligence and what is the mind is perhaps one of the greatest scientific questions of all time. Another application is the development of next generation artificial intelligence. As an example, the human brain is orders of magnitude more power efficient than our current state-of-the-art in artificial intelligence. So by reverse engineering the brain, we may be able to develop more energy efficient and thus practical AI algorithms. And this relates to topics like neuromorphic computing and spiking neural networks. Another reason to build computational models of the brain is that they can help us better understand and thus treat various brain diseases and neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, spinal cord injury, and stroke, which currently affect tens of millions of individuals worldwide. So this research has the potential to have broad clinical translation. And last but not least, these computational models can be used for automation and control of robotic systems. And this has been one of the main applications of our research, such that by reverse engineering the brain, we can program this intelligence into robots to see, think, and move like humans. And if you're interested to learn more about this particular application, I would recommend this recent article published by our hospital entitled Building Robot Brains. Now, although our work in robotics has received widespread international recognition, such as being featured in Forbes and BBC, and was even highlighted in a keynote talk by the president and CEO of NVIDIA, it's really important to emphasize that robotics is just one application, one downstream application of our research. And really what we actually do is build computational models to study the brain and human intelligence. Okay? So my lab at the University of Toronto is currently organized into 3 research programs, which I'll be summarizing today, starting with our research in what we call computational motor control. And the mission of this program is to develop new computational and machine learning models to reverse engineer human motor control. So we want to model and thus understand how neural computations in the motor cortex give rise to complex behavior like movement. And this nicely relates to a quote by Dr. Richard Feynman, who said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So here, we're trying to build an artificial brain in order to better understand the human brain. Now, to help frame this research, here's a photograph of my daughter Sophia taking her very first steps. Now, as a neuroscientist, I can't help but wonder what remarkable computations are happening in her brain and central nervous system, right? How does the brain control and optimize human movement? And the answer is we don't really know. And this is perhaps best illustrated in our ability, or lack thereof, to program and teach machines to move like humans. For example, here's some of the latest robotics research by Google DeepMind that uses deep reinforcement learning for embodied control. And as you can see, the robot comes nowhere close to matching the agility and coordination of a professional footballer like my friend Maxim. Moreover, the human brain is able to achieve this high performance using orders of magnitude less training data and compute, and has arguably generalized intelligence, whereas these machine learning algorithms are trained and optimized for specific tasks. And yet, nearly 3 decades ago, IBM was able to develop an AI-powered computer program that could outperform a world chess champion and grandmaster. So this begs the question, how come we're able to build superhuman intelligence for more cognitive tasks like chess, but not for tasks involving motor control like soccer? Well, One potential reason is that we know the rules of chess, and thus the algorithm that is needed to play and win the game. In contrast, we don't really know the algorithm or fundamental principles that the brain uses to control movement. And this is one of the major unsolved research challenges in computational neuroscience, and thus the focus of my research. Now, there are two ways in which my lab is trying to reverse engineer human motor control. The first is based on optimal control theory, where some biologically inspired objective function is minimized or maximized subject to constraints and the system dynamics with respect to variables like continuous model states and controls. So here, we're using goal-driven optimization to predict human movement in silico without requiring any experimental data because we're modeling the underlying control policy of the brain. However, we first need to state mathematically what is being potentially optimized by the brain to control movement. One of the leading theories in evolutionary biology is that animals, including humans, have evolved to optimize for energy efficiency for tasks such as locomotion. For example, this now famous study by scientists at Harvard discovered that horses tend to naturally select gait speeds that correspond to the speeds of which their cost of transport is minimal, suggesting that an optimization objective function of the biological brain is to maximize energy efficiency. And this principle of optimality taken from neuroscience has actually inspired the design of many humanoid robots to date. Now, this process of reverse engineering what is being optimized by the brain to control movement relates to a concept in control theory known as inverse optimal control. For example, here we developed a new mathematical model of human motor control such that we controlled a neuromechanical model in simulation by optimizing different individual objective functions. And here we solve the optimization using direct collocation. We were then able to study which of these objective functions most accurately predicted experimental motor behaviors and thus best models the underlying control policy of the brain. And this research was in collaboration with the Canadian Sport Institute and Dr. John McPhee, who's the Canada Research Chair in Biomechatronics System Dynamics. Moreover, the subjects for this study were some of our Team Canada Paralympic wheelchair athletes. And we even used medical imaging to personalize the design of our human computer models, which were used for simulation and embodied control. So that's some of our research using optimal control to mathematically model human motor control under the assumption that humans behave optimally. Okay. Now, in addition to optimal control theory, my program also uses reinforcement learning to model human motor control, which takes inspiration from behavioral psychology and dopamine reward-based learning in the brain. And this is especially true for algorithms like temporal difference learning. Now, generally speaking, in reinforcement learning, the goal is to learn an optimal policy that allows an agent to maximize its cumulative reward by exploring and interacting with an environment such that it learns from experience. So at each time step, the agent observes the state of the environment and queries its policy for an action in response to that observation. The agent then takes this action in the environment, resulting in a new state and a reward which is then used to update the policy. And this closed loop framework can be used to design and optimize a controller for human movement such that we can simulate reward-motivated behavior. For example, in one of our studies, we built a predictive controller for a neuromusculoskeletal model to move in a physics simulator, but in a biomimetic way. To do this, we generated thousands of artificial movements, and we trained our agent to learn an optimal policy by imitating these quote-unquote expert demonstrations. And this imitation learning framework is inspired by how the human brain learns by observing and mimicking others. The first layer of our algorithm uses model-free Q learning, and here we use KD trees as our Q tables for an interpretable and efficient policy representation. We then added a second layer to allow our agent to learn sequences of continuous state action decisions. Now, using this new reinforcement learning algorithm, our agent learned to accurately predict experimental motor behaviors while requiring 87 times less compute and 7 times less memory compared to the previous state-of-the-art based on deep deterministic policy gradient, which at a high level better aligns with the efficiency of the human brain. And this research was led by one of my graduate students who I supervise remotely in Ukraine. So that's some of our research in computational motor control. And again, the mission of this program is to develop new computational and machine learning models to reverse engineer human motor control. So ideally, we want to model how neural computations in the motor cortex control and optimize human movement, otherwise known as embodied physical intelligence. Now, over the next several years, my plan is to expand this program to develop deep reinforcement learning algorithms that not only predict experimental motor behaviors, but that are also more neuroanatomically aligned to the brain. So here, we'll be using artificial neural networks to model the reinforcement learning control policy in order to more directly compare with the biological neural networks in the brain, thus gaining a better mechanistic understanding of human motor control. And this differs from the classic Turing tests as I previously introduced, which only studied the output behavior between humans and machines. Whereas here, we'll also be studying the internal neural circuits. And this has implications for the broader field of mechanistic interpretability, such that we can reverse engineer the internal mechanisms within a neural network into more explainable computations by comparing them to the human brain. Another area we're interested in exploring is that of data efficiency. For example, unlike these robots at Google DeepMind, which are used to generate large-scale data to train their deep learning and reinforcement learning algorithms, the human brain is extremely data efficient and requires minimal examples to learn a novel behavior. And I even see this with my daughter Sophia, who's sometimes able to achieve one-shot imitation learning. And this may be attributed to strong inductive biases in her brain, which have been acquired from experience and/or evolution. So this fundamental disparity between training artificial neural networks, which tend to be quite data inefficient, and the training of biological neural networks in the human brain is something we're planning to study in the future. So that's some of our research in computational motor control. Next, I'll talk about our research in brain-machine interfaces. And the mission of this program is to develop new computational and machine learning models to decode neural activity from the brain, which represent and encode information about cognitive processes and behaviors, for example, motor control. Now, to develop these neural decoding algorithms, my program uses a variety of neurobiological signals, ranging from indirect to more direct measurements of brain function. Okay. For example, in one of our studies, we optimized the architecture and synaptic weights of a recurrent neural network via supervised learning to decode descending motor commands from the brain as recorded using surface electromyography, or EMG. And here, we were able to decode the neural signals with over 94% classification accuracy across more than 100 subjects performing various motor control tasks, which really speaks to the generalizability of our optimized deep learning model. And this study was part of an international collaboration with computer science students from Ukraine. Now, motivated by these results, we're now in the process of building an open source EMG foundation model to provide the research community with a large pre-trained neural network which can be used for transfer learning and domain adaptation, including out of distribution generalization to clinical populations. Taking this neural decoding research a step further, my lab is also involved in developing real-time embedded neural controllers. And here's one such example. Now, for this system, we've been able to optimize the closed-loop control to be less than 3 milliseconds, but we've since updated this design to use a neuromusculoskeletal model to more quickly and reliably convert neuromuscular activity into muscle and joint dynamics. In addition to achieving these fast processing speeds, our neural controllers have also consistently demonstrated a relatively high degree of accuracy and precision of motor control across a wide range of volitional movements. And here's one such example in my lab at the University of Toronto, where by simply thinking about moving her leg, my student is able to neurally control this robotic actuator. And here we provide visual feedback on the computer for real-time closed-loop control. Now, in addition to EMG neural interfaces, my program also uses non-invasive electroencephalography, or EEG, to develop and test new neural decoding algorithms. And as computational neuroscientists, we specifically specialize in developing these algorithms, which are used to decode or predict the intended behavior based on patterns of neural activity recorded in the brain. For example, we recently conducted one of the largest comparative studies to systematically test different signal processing algorithms, feature extractors, and machine learning classifiers in order to determine the optimal combination for EEG neural decoding, which remains an open problem in the field of brain-machine interfaces. And here, we were able to consistently achieve over 95% classification accuracy across all subjects and algorithms, whereby we use supervised learning to automatically learn this nonlinear mapping between brain activity and output motor behavior. And this research was also in collaboration with several computer science students from Ukraine. Now, whereas the neural decoders in this study were optimized for individual subjects, one of the long-term goals of my program is to develop a universal neural decoding algorithm that can generalize across multiple users and tasks, thus minimizing the need for repetitive data collection and neural network retraining. So towards this long-term goal, we recently prototyped a new unsupervised deep contrastive learning algorithm that learns discriminative representations for domain adaptation. And here, we were able to decode the brain dynamics of a target subject during motor imagery without requiring any label training data for that individual. And this is known as zero calibration neural decoding, such that we trained our target subject decoding model using brain recordings from source subjects who we uniquely determined to fall within the same cluster. We were also able to significantly outperform the previous state-of-the-art in cases where we have a small amount of label training data, and this is referred to as low calibration neural decoding. As a result of these developments, we were recently awarded Best Paper Award at the Toronto Robotics Conference, and this research was featured on a number of Toronto news networks. So that's some of our research in brain-machine interfaces. And again, the mission of this program is to develop new computational and machine learning models to decode neural activity from the brain, which encode information about cognitive processes and behaviors such as motor control. So our goal is to advance brain-machine interface research, but from a computational neuroscience perspective. Okay. Over the next several years, my plan is to expand this program to closed-loop brain-machine interfaces, where our neural decoding algorithms continuously adapt to neuroplasticity and motor learning in the brain. So in this co-adaptation paradigm, the human brain is learning from the artificial brain, and the artificial brain is learning from the human brain. And to address this challenge of mutual learning and shared control, we're planning to develop a new reinforcement learning model. Now, most of our research to date has focused on using non-invasive EEG neural interfaces. However, moving forward, we're planning to explore other electrophysiological sensors and brain imaging technologies in order to study neuropopulation dynamics. And one such example are implanted microarrays, which provide high temporal and spatial resolution and allow us to record the spiking responses of hundreds of individual neurons in the brain simultaneously. So this is high dimensional neural data. And for those that don't know, our hospital was recently selected to run the first clinical trials in Canada for Neuralink. And here's a photograph of me holding the brain implant. Lastly, I just want to mention that in addition to discrete classification tasks, as I previously described, our neural decoding algorithms can also be used for regression tasks, such as continuously forward predicting limb kinematics based on neural activity recorded in the brain. So that's some of our research in brain-machine interfaces. I'll now discuss my third and final research program focused on computer vision, where our mission is to develop new deep learning models of visual intelligence inspired by the visual information processing neural networks in the brain. Now, while there have been significant advances in deep learning for computer vision, a large portion of which has been fueled by research and development in autonomous driving, there are still many unsolved challenges to visual perception in real-world environments, as most Canadians have experienced. Moreover, many deep learning models still struggle with even minor adversarial attacks, such as these physical stickers shown on the right, whereas the human brain can easily adapt to these perturbations and recognize the stop signs. And this lack of robustness can have significant implications for safety and performance in applications such as self-driving cars. So the machine learning community is still working to achieve human-level visual intelligence. Now, as a neuroscientist, I take inspiration from how does the human brain solve these tasks? Well, there's a pathway in the visual cortex known as the ventral stream, which is mainly responsible for object recognition. So, beginning with subcortical areas that receive a visual stimuli, the ventral stream then processes and encodes this information by learning hierarchical representations through networks of neurons. Starting with area V1, which detects really simple features like edges and orientations, to increasingly more complex patterns of abstraction, such as faces and scenes in IT cortex. And this entire process takes approximately 100 milliseconds to go from stimulus to output behavior. Now, this neuroanatomy and information processing in the brain has been a source of inspiration for deep learning models in computer vision. And one famous example is the AlexNet model developed by our very own Dr. Jeffrey Hinton, who showed for the first time that with large-scale training data and compute, that convolutional neural networks could achieve state-of-the-art performance on image classification tasks. And due to this and other seminal contributions, Dr. Hinton was recently awarded the Nobel Prize, and this was a proud moment for our entire University of Toronto community. So these convolutional neural networks can be viewed as both functional and structural models of the brain, such that they can perform visual recognition tasks and are organized in a multi-layer hierarchical architecture. So this leads to my computer vision program, which to date has focused on developing what we refer to as performance optimized deep learning models. And this simply means that we optimize our neural networks for performance, like speed or accuracy, on large-scale visual recognition tasks, like image classification, rather than explicitly mimicking the neural representations in the brain in response to a visual stimuli. Okay? And this starting point for our research was initially motivated by this interesting study from MIT, which showed that when neural networks are optimized for task performance, like image classification, they also tend to exhibit higher neural predictivity, meaning that they're more brain-like, at least up to a point. Okay. So back in 2018, we developed our first convolutional neural network for visual perception of real-world walking environments. And while relatively simple, this preliminary study demonstrated the feasibility of optimizing a deep learning model end-to-end for this new computer vision application, achieving over 95% image classification accuracy. Nevertheless, here are some interesting examples where our neural network misclassified the environment as inclined stairs. And we often reference this top left image as being particularly challenging even for the human visual system. As a result of this research, we were nominated for Best Paper Award at the International Conference on Rehabilitation Robotics, and this study was in collaboration with Dr. Alexander Wong, who's the Canada Research Chair in Artificial Intelligence and Medical Imaging. Now, since then, we've developed dozens of neural networks for various computer vision tasks. For example, in one study, we developed a new deep learning model for visual scene recognition, but we also optimized the model for efficiency to support mobile deployment and real-time inference. And here we used a neural processing unit, or NPU, for more brain-like neuromorphic computing. We even got invited to showcase this system to the president of South Korea, and this research was in collaboration with Dr. Alex Mihailides, also shown here in the photograph, who's the scientific director of AgeWell. In addition to mobile computing, we've also deployed our neural networks on low-power embedded systems in order to create smart glasses. And we think that this new design is more practical for embodied visual intelligence in real-world environments. So over the years, we've developed dozens of deep learning models for various computer vision tasks. And to optimize these neural networks using supervised learning, my program has also been leading the development of large-scale image datasets. In fact, we've created one of the largest open source datasets of egocentric images of real-world environments with over 5.6 million images, including human annotations. This dataset includes both indoor and outdoor scenes, and we uniquely collected these images across multiple seasons in order to capture different weathered surfaces like snow, grass, and multicolored leaves. That being said, the human brain doesn't necessarily learn to do visual recognition via supervised learning on large-scale datasets, right? When I'm teaching my daughter Sophia about the names of different objects and animals, I don't provide her millions of training images with high-level semantic labels like we do in computer vision. So, in addition to supervised learning, my program is also involved in exploring more biologically plausible models of learning in the brain. For example, in one of our studies, we developed a new semi-supervised learning algorithm that uses large amounts of unlabeled data to learn visual representations in order to minimize the number of labeled images needed to train neural network models. And using this new algorithm, we've been able to achieve high image classification accuracy of nearly 99%, while requiring 35% fewer labeled images compared to the previous state-of-the-art based on supervised learning, thus significantly improving training efficiency. And this research was led by one of my graduate students who I supervise remotely in Ukraine. Now, in addition to convolutional neural networks, my program is also involved in studying recurrent neural networks for visual perception, which take inspiration from the recurrent feedback connections in the brain used to integrate temporal information over time. So these neural networks can process sequential inputs like videos. For example, we previously showed that compared to convolutional neural networks that use independent static images, neural networks with temporal dynamics can improve classification accuracy, but have disproportionately higher computational and memory storage requirements. And we quantify this trade-off in performance using this efficiency metric, which balances the classification accuracy with the number of neural network parameters and numerical operations, which is relevant to neuroscience research given the real-time processing and computational constraints of the human brain. And this research was also in collaboration with a computer science student from Ukraine. Now, everything I've discussed thus far uses RGB images, which encode visual information in two spatial dimensions. However, depth perception also plays an important role in visual intelligence. So, taking inspiration from neuroscience, we've been building a new monocular depth estimation algorithm that uses deep learning to reconstruct 3D environments from 2D images. As an example, here's an RGB image of a natural scene. Here's the corresponding depth measurement using a depth camera. And here's the depth estimation using our new depth estimation neural network. Now, although these results are still preliminary, thus far we've been able to estimate object height and distance parameters with accuracies that are relatively comparable to state-of-the-art depth cameras. So that's just a snapshot of some of our research in computer vision. And again, the mission of this program is to develop new deep learning models of visual intelligence inspired by the visual information processing neural networks in the brain. Now, over the next several years, my plan is to expand this program beyond performance-optimized deep learning models to more neuroanatomically aligned models that also predict the neural representations in the brain. So here we'll be comparing the output behavior between humans and machines performing the same tasks, like visual object recognition, but we'll also be comparing the internal computations within the neural networks, such as comparing layer by layer the spike rates of populations of neurons. And again, this goes back to this idea of extending the classic Turing test beyond just studying the output behavior between humans and machines to also studying the internal neural representations in order to gain a better mechanistic understanding of intelligence. Okay? So that's a fairly high-level overview of my lab at the University of Toronto, which, to reiterate, is currently organized into three main research programs, where we're developing reinforcement learning models to reverse engineer how neural computations in the motor cortex control and optimize human movement. We're also building neural decoding algorithms to predict user intent for brain-machine interfaces. And we're also developing deep learning models of visual intelligence inspired by the visual information processing neural networks in the visual cortex. And it's important to re-emphasize that these computational models of the sensory and motor systems in the brain can have widespread applications, only one of which is robotics. So my lab explores this intersection between neuroscience and machine learning, where we use AI and machine learning to study the brain, but we also use the human brain as inspiration to build new AI algorithms. Now, admittedly, most of our research in the past has focused on AI-powered brain science. However, there is enormous and relatively untapped potential in developing brain-inspired AI algorithms. For instance, many leading tech companies are in an arms race to develop the world's first general artificial intelligence, or AGI, which is perhaps one of the greatest engineering challenges of all time. However, our only known example of general intelligence is that of humans. So, by reverse engineering the brain, we may be able to discover new fundamental principles which could allow us to build human-level artificial intelligence. And this is somewhat analogous to flight in that airplanes don't necessarily fly because they were engineered to look like birds, but rather because both use the same fundamental principles and laws of physics. So the long-term vision for my research program is to discover similar fundamental principles of intelligence that could apply to both biological and artificial brains. That being said, I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my students. It's an honor to lead this incredibly talented and creative team of computer scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and neuroscientists. And this diversity has really been essential to our research in computational neuroscience, which is highly multidisciplinary. I also want to thank the various academic, industry, and government organizations that fund and support our research. And thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you, Brokoslav. Questions, colleagues? Go ahead, Dimitri. You can type questions in the chat. You can directly unmute your microphone and speak. Second is preferred. Teresa, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, really interesting talk. My question is about the hardware. So current computer systems are based on pairwise interactions, whereas neurons are not pairwise, they're integrative. And I'm wondering if you think that innovations or potentially transformation of current hardware is necessary to achieve your goals.
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say that in my lab, we really try to place a lot of emphasis on the algorithms and understanding the computations within artificial neural networks and the brain. But the reality is that this has to be synergistically paired with the hardware in which we're doing inference of these models. And I often think back to some of the work that I was doing. I did my master's and PhD at the University of Waterloo. And at the University of Waterloo, we have this Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. And a big component of the work that's done there is this area of co-design and co-optimization, where we have neuromorphic chips, and then we're also developing spiking neural networks. And it's one thing to develop models like spiking neural networks that in some high level mimic the computations within the brain at a high level. But in order to, in some ways, recapitulate or some way simulate the efficiency of the human brain, or at least en route to achieving the same efficiency as the brain, it's important that these models be co-designed and co-optimized with the hardware in which they're performing inference. And we don't do that in my current lab, and I find that many labs don't necessarily do this, where they're either working on the models like spiking neural networks, or they're developing the neuromorphic chips by taking inspiration from the brain. But I think there's more and more evidence to suggest that unless you do both at the same time, it's not the same as taking a convolutional neural network and deploying that on a neuromorphic chip, or taking spiking neural networks and deploying that on a traditional GPU accelerator. And so you really kind of need to do both at the same time in order, or ideally to do both at the same time, if one's ultimate goal is to achieve efficiency that is closer to what we see in the brain. So that long answer is just to say that we focus mainly on the models right now, but truth be told, in our long-term pursuit of understanding the brain and developing AI models that match human-level intelligence, one of the kind of future directions of the lab is starting to incorporate that co-design and co-optimization of neuromorphic computing.
Nice, thank you.
More questions, colleagues? Meantime, I have a question. For me personally, the most interesting part of your talk was the brain-computer interfaces. This is what at least my team works on. I got interested in that motor imagery decoder with 95% accuracy. Is this a person-independent, session-independent model? Because that's very rare to have such high accuracy with non-invasive electrodes. What is the hardware and how the model, and what is the model?
Yeah, so the hardware, this is not deployed hardware. So it's really important to emphasize, let me, where's my mouse here? I'm kind of getting lost here. It's really important to emphasize that the brain-computer interface research that we've done thus far is open loop, okay? Is open loop. As of right now, we have yet to deploy our neural decoding algorithms in a closed loop control setting. So we're just talking about decoding intent in a feed-forward sense, okay? So we have to be a little bit careful about kind of the claims that we're making, in that we can use this for real-time neural decoding and control of, say, a computer cursor or a robotic arm, though we are working in that space moving forward. Previously, the algorithms that we were developing, all of this is done, all of the inference is done in the cloud. So we don't often report any of our real-time compute for at least our brain-machine interface research, except for EMG stuff, which we have done closed loop control. So that answers your question about the compute. How we're able to achieve such high performance, this is for one individual. And so what we do is we have essentially, the way in which we do this is not necessarily a case where we can do this for everybody. We form clusters of source subjects, and we have models for each one of these clusters. And so when we bring in a new participant, we can identify very rapidly which cluster are they able to be a part of, which cluster best encapsulates the representations that we see in their brain dynamics for a given movement. Now, how we achieve such high accuracy, a little caveat there is that the neural dynamics is a function of the movement. So in order to have really tight experiments and controls, we do very selective confined movements. These are not freely behaving individuals. Otherwise, things would be incredibly noisy and it'd be really hard to discriminate between different motor tasks and one subject or between subjects performing a motor task. So kind of the caveat and the part that I didn't mention in that one particular slide is that this is for a very controlled environment performing a very low dimensional movement. And that is one way to kind of minimize the search space of potential solutions for the algorithm. So it's not a real world setting because it's very, very controlled and it's for a very select movement task. So yeah, this kind of comes back to this idea of as we start moving towards actually deployed settings and expanding the movement that we're doing and the way in which we're decoding and adapting to the human as they're performing the task or multiple tasks, this we'll have to kind of recalibrate and reevaluate how our algorithm is performing that particular one that you're referring to.
Brokoslav, on this very slide, I don't want to take all to take the attention and the questions, but on this very slide, you said in this human in the loop, closed loop brain computer interface, you plan to use reinforcement learning.
Mm-hmm.
That's slow, super slow.
So reinforcement learning is used to update the user. Reinforcement learning is not where the vision that we have is not using reinforcement learning for online control, but to adapt the model, not in real time, but over some coarse granularity. So perhaps on a day basis, on an hour basis, it's to update the weights within the neural network, the neural decoder, as a function of some time. Now, the caveat is what is that time, right? I didn't kind of mention what time scale. The motivation here is that part of my affiliation in Toronto is that I'm affiliated with a rehabilitation hospital. So the hospital that I'm associated with, they're interested to know how do technologies like this, how should they be adapted as a function of the rehabilitation process? Like as one is like going through and changing one's motor behavior. And so that time scale over the course of days or weeks or months, maybe even years, the idea is that we'll be using reinforcement learning to adapt the neural decoder as a function of the rehabilitation process, not necessarily as a function of on the time scale of milliseconds or seconds. So you are correct. And so it's not necessarily that it's not used as a function of adaptive control, but it's over what time scale is kind of the devils are in the details with regards to the time scale in which I'm referring to.
Okay, more questions, colleagues? Please feel free to unmute the microphone and to ask the question. Anyone? Okay, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Brokoslav for the interesting talk and eventually to think about some time coming over and having a discussion and conversation in person. Thank you, Brokoslav.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for attending the talk, dear colleagues. With this, thank you very much. Thank you all. And we stop the recording.